Walk me through what happened when your father passed away and you discovered he had been an alcoholic on his deathbed. What did that reveal to you that you'd been missing, both in your relationship with him and your understanding of who he was?
So let me start by kind of setting the stage for everyone with how exactly I came to learn this information, because I think it's important context there. It was the summer of 2020. All of us, life was in crazy upheaval. None of us really knew what the next day was going to bring. And at that point in time, I was in the process of moving from New York out to Los Angeles. For about a month before we were going to do that, my partner at the time she and I were living in San Diego. And I'm sitting at my computer working one day. And, I think every Gen Z and millennial person can relate to this, but sitting at my computer working and my mom calls me in the middle of the workday. And you're like, of course, you're going to ask me, what am I doing right now? And no surprise, I'm working, obviously. And I ignore the call. And she calls me right back. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because we are not a call twice family. We are planets who orbit a shared sun. And occasionally we'll be in alignment, but not much more than that. And I knew that this was the call that would change the rest of my life. Lo and behold, it was. I would find out that my father had had a series of medical episodes in a very short period of time and was now unconscious in the hospital. The next day, flew down to Florida, would be there for the next 2 weeks as we kind of navigated this medical craziness before he eventually passed. And as you just mentioned here, the real kind of reveal in all of this was that on his deathbed, I found out he was an alcoholic. And this didn't come to me from information from him. It didn't come to me from information from a sibling of his. He didn't have any. It didn't come to me from a sibling of mine. It didn't come to me from my mother. It came because we were doing what so many of us had to do at that period of time, to find out information about our loved ones in a hospital. We were getting on the phone constantly to talk to doctors and nurses who were experiencing them. And one doctor one day finally asked, as my mother and I were on the phone, was he a heavy drinker? And my mom said, it's been COVID. We maybe finished 1 or 2 bottles of wine between us in the past, at that point, 5 months that we've been locked up in the house. And growing up, I'd never seen my parents really drink alcohol that much, other than an occasional drink or two out at dinner. They weren't the type to have big parties at the house or anything like that. And he said, "Are you sure?" And my mom said, "Yes." And then he said, "Well, he's clearly been lying to you, because he presents with all the symptoms of a chronic alcoholic." And that opened the floodgates to a series of conversations over the next few weeks and years that have continued to this day about what exactly my father's relationship to alcohol was, the addiction that he suffered from, and really how a secret like that can metastasize and continue inside a familial unit. And for me, it set me on a crazy journey. It's part of why you and I are here talking today. And at first, it's making you think about, how does this persist within a family? How can this secret be protected and carried and not revealed? And once I started to process that, it was really to start to understand how this impacts what my relationship was to my father and how I understand him, because I was never able to talk to him about it, right? He was unconscious when I found out, and he died while in that state of unconsciousness. He never came back. So I never got to ask him in his own words what it was that he suffered from and what his experience was. So much of that means, on the one hand, how different our relationship and how different I understand it because of that. I went through my whole life fighting him with one arm tied behind my back, because I just thought he was an asshole. But the reality is, I really needed that other arm because he was in immense pain and I needed to reach out and give him a hug. But I had no idea, because there was this huge gulf between us in terms of what I perceived him as and what he was able to express himself as. And I think it's important to say that I don't believe that I could have fixed or healed that addiction, because that's so much bigger that when one person can do. And I don't think it's fair to any of us who know people or have loved ones who suffer from addiction to have that expectation of ourselves. But I do believe it could have changed how we related to one another. And that's something that would have been really, really significant for me. And then the final piece of that journey was, okay, now I've understood our family, my relationship to him, but really, what did it mean for him to have this addiction, and what caused this, and what caused this isolation, and what made him turn towards it? And that's what kind of started me in this universe of men's work, what brought us together at the Marketing to Men Summit, to this conversation today, to understand that part of the reason that he turned to a bottle for solace and consolation was that he didn't believe it was his job, or it was right for him as a man to come out and express what he wanted, which was to be loved, to know love, to express love, and to receive it. And Now, as I look back on him now, what I see is someone who so desperately wanted love and affection. And he did try really hard to provide that and to get that and to give that, but he had no idea how to adjust it for the person on the other end of that interaction. And I think that's what led to so much of his eventual despair.
Something I'm curious about, you mentioned the one arm reaching out and so badly wishing that other arm was there. I think for many of us guys, when we're especially boys, we have this larger than life perspective of our fathers, for better or for worse. There tends to be this subconscious kind of reverence. And yet you speak to something within that dynamic that's so true, that many of us go our whole lives without truly knowing our fathers. Like, we know about them, we know what they do, we know the jobs that they work, we kind of have certain personality traits that we can put together, but we don't know the ins and outs. And certainly it's different than what a partner would know. But I am curious what your perspective of him up to that point of finding out was in general. And more so, how did finding out that information change your understanding of him as a person?
It's funny that you say that part at the beginning of your question here around not really having a fuller understanding of him that other people do in their experience of him. And that's certainly a huge part of what my journey in managing my grief had been is, okay, how do I fill in the rest of this picture that I have? And what I came to realize, and this is a side anecdote before I answer your question, I process a lot of my grief through writing, both in journaling as well as in like creative output. I wrote a whole book about how to process this as like a fictional memoir, I called it. It's not something that was ever published or went anywhere because I also realized I was way too early in my grieving process to have something publishable. But the whole thesis of it and the whole conceit of the book was the conversations we never got to have. And what I realized as I was putting that together is there was nobody I could talk to because there was so many secrets on the one hand, and on the other hand, because he was so isolated. There was no one who I could turn to who could fill in the picture the way I wanted. Everybody kind of just saw a different slice of this. And even if I brought them all together, they didn't make the whole pie. And I'll kind of stop on the topic there because I think that gets us into the issue of kind of like loneliness and friendship and connection, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. But to get back to the answer to your question about kind of how I perceived him previously and how this changed that, my father and I did not have a great relationship. We were in no way, separated from one another. I didn't avoid him. I hadn't written him out of my life, but I definitely kept my father within a container in the way that he related to my life in its entirety. And I think the best way to explain that is that when he did pass, I think, the way the sequence of events happened, the day we got the call from the doctor and they told us he's not making it, I cried. When I saw him in the hospital for the last time, I cried. But on the day that he died, I didn't really cry too much. I know I shed a few tears, but I cried a little bit then, and then that was kind of it. I didn't really have that full body emotional response too much more after that. I remember my girlfriend at the time was kind of like thrown off by that. You may have thoughts on this for what I'm about to say, but I talked to a therapist about it. I feel like the response I'm supposed to be having, the response I'm having are not really the same, right? I feel like I should be more broken than I am. And this therapist that I had at the time kind of called back to, well, Jonathan, you told me previously about the relationship the two of you had, and told her a lot about it previously because it was the source of a lot of issues. But she said, you used to talk about, you would tell me about how when you were a child, you used to think about what it would be like if he disappeared, whether he just left and never came back, whether he died. And I have these vivid memories of hoping he would just fall into the rug and disappear because he caused so much emotional pain for me. And she said, in your mind, you wrote him off so long ago that you've been preparing for this your whole life. You've closed off parts of your psyche and your heart to him such that like, okay, the part that he was still in is grieving, but you as a person are still kind of surrounding that and moving on from it. And whether or not a therapist like yourself or others might agree with that, I don't know. But for me, that kind of clicked and made a little bit of sense to it. So I say that to say my perspective of him before was very much not, the idealization that we've kind of talked about a little bit in the beginning of this question, or like the Leave It to Beaver style, family tie style, like dad as the head of household kind of thing, but much more. I did see him as like a broken, imperfect figure who also inflicted a lot of pain within my familial unit. And the second part of this is, how does what I know about him now change that? That was a really interesting process of trying to understand. And at the first part, when this was all happening, I had dinner with a good friend and his wife. And one her way of consoling me, and this is not me saying that what she did was right or wrong, but what she said to me was, when my father died, he died of an issue that was like very secret, something we were very, very ashamed of. It had to do with his like professional life. He was a physician, and some issues surrounding that. And I don't want to reveal too much for those purposes, but basically her comment back to me was, there was your dad and there's this person who did this thing. And you need to keep these two things separate because you saw him as this. You never saw this person. And for a while I said, okay, that kind of makes sense. But the more I processed it, I said, well, it doesn't matter if I never saw him drink. He was still an addict. It doesn't matter if I never saw him drink. He was still hungover that next day. And that affects how you show up as a person, whether or not I know that's what it is. And for me, I said, I actually have to integrate these two things because it helps me understand and heal from the way he treated me and treated my family in a way that's actually much more fair to him than just holding him as this mean, nasty person. And that's why I say when I talk about like having the hand come out from behind my back, I was like, okay, now I have this uniform understanding. And I don't forgive him for what he did that kind of drove wedges into different places. But I understand why now. And that helps me find more peace with everything that happened.
There's a few things you said that really struck me. The first is as you're grieving, how powerful it is just to write things out. When you write it out, it makes sense. There's a lot of work by Dr. James Pennebaker at University of Texas, essentially talked about how much your quality of life increases in many capacities, not just by writing it out, but also writing what that experience meant to you. So it's not just leaving it at making sense of it. I think that's the first part, but then making the meaning within what makes sense of it. So for anyone who's wants or needs to process something really complex and meaningful, I would suggest the journaling and writing. It's so sacred.
And I'll tell you, it's not just for that, but for like any major life transition, that's the hack of what I do. Like I write a letter to that person or that thing. I read it out loud and then I burn it in the sink. And I was like, you know what? I got it out of me. I'm not holding it anymore. It's not festering inside of me. So like breakups, when I sold my business, like any major kind of life moment where I'm just having all the big feelings, that is what I do every time. And I feel so much better afterwards for having done it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you expanded that beyond any major thing in the sense
Mm.
of just waiting until death. I think it's certainly all these other parts of transition. And the second is, something that I use in my therapy is essentially having these imaginative conversations with someone that either they've passed or they don't have the capacity to have that conversation in real life. And this is more trauma informed stuff. It's going back into the memories and re-experiencing them through the lens of being empowered and whole and not traumatized, but facing that trauma in safety, but also security and confidence. So not leaving that old script of what it did to you, continue to kind of wreak havoc on your life, but just through the imagination, going back into your memories and reframing it. And like you said, like seeing that person, for who they are. And within that, this is kind of adjunct to that is I really appreciate you mentioning that can be this idolized version of a father, but there can also be, let's say, this disappointed, like less than ideal version that is realistic in many men's minds. And I would say there's probably a bit of both, right? There was probably times in your mind the reason why you were hurt is because you had an expectation he would be better, he would be more whole, he would come through and be more present. There's a subconscious standard that we kind of know, like, this is what I deserve, like this is what he should have been for me. Yet I'm so painfully aware of how much he fell short of that. The point where I actually feel like him not being in my life, and this is what the therapist was getting at, and I agree, right? It's your defense mechanism to feel safe because he's a constant source of pain. You actually have to, even if it's in your imagination, remove his existence, because that's not a safe presence for you in your life. And of course, ideally, we want those people to be in our lives. But if they're a constant source of pain that's causing dysregulation consistently, then like we need to have that removal. So I affirm that sense of like not the lack of tears. I wouldn't even say lack of tears, just like how much you cried, I think is an appropriate level of expression and like true processing of what he meant to you and what he didn't mean to you. And that's a real thing. I think sometimes people feel this pressure, and we see this a lot in funerals, right? Like, we want to come up with all these really amazing things to say about this person. It's like, yeah, it's really good to honor the innate goodness that people have, but like also people did a lot of things that weren't. And like, it caused a lot of real issues. So that's the second part.
I want to say one thing on that real because I think you hit the nail on the head with that. And I'll just say from my own experience of processing the grief around his death and having people try to figure out how to show up for me during that time, you realize how, I don't think I'm certainly not the first one to say this. And I think Chimamanda in her book, Notes on Grief, said something very similar. But basically, you realize how ill equipped the English language is to support people going through grief because we all default to, I'm so sorry for your loss and hope you're doing okay, and all those kind of things. When the reality is, maybe that loss was actually great. Maybe that loss actually was helpful for me. And I'm not looking for you to like hold me in a point of despair, but rather invite me into a conversation about how I'm actually doing about this whole thing. I'll give you, yes, it's sad. I feel terrible that this man went through his life in so much pain, that his life was cut short. He was only 67 years old when this happened. There was no need for him to die so young, but also his death unlocked a world of opportunity for me as a person and for us as a family to heal, to reconnect, to grow, and have new experiences that we never would have had the chance to have if he was still alive. And it's important to be able to see both those things. And the one other thing I'll give you before you move on to the third point there was, you talk about being able to better understand and shade and color the actions that he did take that were terrible and painful and hurtful. And I've been able to recode all of those now in a way that I had already healed from them, but there's just unlocking this whole new element of healing that I didn't know I still needed to do. So I should say, I thought I had healed from them. And the example I'll give you is there's so many memories you forget and then you remember and you're like, oh, right, this is a core thing I probably should think about from time to time. There was a time when I was a kid playing, stickball in the street with my friends, and my dad came out of the house and he pantsed me in the middle of the street. And like, I was a kid in high school, right? And that's incredible. Not high school, probably middle school at the time, or maybe late elementary school. It's incredibly embarrassing. Like, I remember just running into the house and running into my room because we were playing in front of my house. And I was like devastated. And he had no idea what he had done. At the time, you're just like, why the hell are you doing this? Like, you're an adult man. What are you coming outside for and doing this to your own son? But now I look at that and go like, he wanted the laugh and the affection of all these other kids because he still wanted that for himself. And in that moment, I was like a tool to be able to get that because that's the thing he so desperately wanted. This is me hypothesizing a little bit, maybe from young boys, because he wasn't getting that from his own son, that this was his way of potentially picking that up in an environment. So it's been incredibly helpful to allow me to really be able to better contextualize and understand those experiences.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, what you're getting at is a concept I use in the therapeutic work is not over personalizing someone's actions. Not because it's not personal, but because usually it's not personal to you. It's not about you. That person has unresolved shit that they're essentially using you as a pawn in the game. And it doesn't take away the negative effects it has on you experientially. You have to acknowledge, well, they made me feel angry, sad, embarrassed, all the things. And yet, wow, if I can kind of peek through the fog, pull back the curtain, this person is deeply insecure and it's their broken attempt at trying to be loved. And while I would never in a million years relate to that, it is what it is. And I think the third point I was saying is I agree with your kind of final processing of kind of reflecting on what your friend said about separating the two. I think initially, yeah, I can see how it's helpful, but I agree that deep down, we have to realize for better and for worse, we are integrated people. And that means that if we don't honor and actually name the shadow side that is causing the pain, we actually don't see the person in light of who they are fully. And therefore, we actually can't fully grieve who they are. There's a separation in this kind of like isolated that I would go as far to say is in some ways bypassing, right? I mean, it's kind of like this whole conversation of like genetic placement. Like, is it ethical to choose the genes? Like, we can't just
Right,
say like
right.
we want these and we don't want these.
Exactly.
And yeah, I appreciate you naming that. And speaking of differences and kind of breaking things into two forms. You talk about the difference between masculinity itself and the cultural imprint. This idea that we've essentially overdialed certain traits like courage and we've underdialed others like vulnerability. So, can you walk me through what you mean by that dial analogy that you use and what happens to a man when his dials are set by culture instead of what's actually needed?
Yeah, for sure. So, this is, I've been blessed to be in a lot of conversations and circles where we're part of this dialogue to think about what is masculinity, what does manhood in America look like, and what does that all mean? And I think there's been a real false flag operation in the discourse over the past 2 or 3 years, especially around this idea and concept of masculinity. And it started probably with the over promotion of the phrase toxic masculinity. The implicit part of that a lot of people take away from hearing it, whether or not the communicator intended that, is all masculinity is toxic, not that toxicism is a modifier to a certain type of masculinity. So I think that phrase has done a lot of damage that we're still trying to unwork. And the reason for that is I believe masculinity in and of itself is not toxic in the same way that femininity in and of itself is not toxic. Men in and of themselves are not toxic. Women in and of themselves are not toxic. It's an extension of that. And that is because masculinity is just a set of traits. Whatever things we want to throw into this bucket that represents masculinity that we kind of commonly consider bravery, courage, providership, protectorship, whatever those are, they're inherently neutral. There's nothing good or bad about them, and they can be good or bad depending on how they are represented and utilized. The problem that we have isn't with masculinity. It is with the culture that says and dictates how to be a man, how to be masculine. So that's where we get in this conversation, the language I use around American manhood being the real source of the problem. It's the sea or the culture of masculinity that we are asked to swim within that says, only represent these traits. Do not represent these. Dial it up to 100 on the bravery. Dial it up to 100 on the aggressiveness. Dial down your vulnerability to zero. That kind of, you're in Frankenstein's lab here creating what is this archetypical American male, but actually has a ton of problems kind of that lie at the core of this rot here. And the reason I identify culture as such a key part of that is because, listen, there's issues with masculinity, just as there might be issues with femininity everywhere, but they're all uniquely different and kind of geolocated to the culture in which they emerge. And I think that the example I always use of that is think about the acceptability of displays of affection towards your fellow man in, let's just say, Western cultures, specifically, let's use like Canadian and American versus perhaps nations in the Middle East, right? So I lived for a time in Morocco. It is not uncommon there to see PDA between men, whether that is putting your arm around one another, cheek and air kisses, whether it's hugging, whether it's holding hands. It's very, very common and it's an accepted part of the culture. Doing any of those things here, sus. Immediate sus behavior, things you would never do because you would be afraid of how they are coded because our culture tells us that as a part of American manhood, like physical affection for a fellow man, not a masculine behavior, but is commonly accepted somewhere else. So that's why I use culture as really the lens for it to say, this is what we're swimming in. That's telling us what we're supposed to express. It is not innate to the idea of masculinity or manhood.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that point because I think we as a country can become, no matter what your belief is, this kind of superiority complex, right? Like, well, this is just how it is, right? This is the way, and our way is the best. And I think that insular view has created a lot of issues. And, you mentioned specifically like American culture, because politics so deeply define a lot of our cultural ideology, right? In my exploration on this podcast, I feel like it's very clear the common dials, not all, that have unintentionally or intentionally been turned up too much, and then ones that need to be turned up more on the right. It's very distinctive. Like a classic example, right, is like the machismo, just kind of like gun carrying, God fearing, Wrangler jean wearing kind of guy, right? That is more stoic. I'm curious what your experience has been and your understanding of maybe what the left's understanding of masculinity has been, in like what dials have been overturned, and then which ones maybe need to be turned up more?
That's actually a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. So kudos, because I think that's an important part of the equation we don't really think enough about. You know, you and I are certainly not the first people to sit on a podcast and discuss the issues that the left has had with speaking to men and reaching men and trying to diagnose how we got here and what we have to do next. And I think the first thing that always comes to mind for me in these conversations is we have taken away the idea of pride in the identity of being a man, which is it's not something to stand here and say, I'm a man. Like I'm okay and I'm great and I love being this and that's really good. And I think allowing people to more fully embody themselves without that being a threat to the identity of someone else. Because I think for so long, again, we have defined being a man in our dominance, hegemonic based culture as being 100% provider, protector, aggressive, that the counter for that has become don't acknowledge that identity rather than saying, I am this identity, but I'm also pulling this back. So the one thing that always comes to mind for me is allowing men to fully embody themselves again, which means acknowledging like I am a man, I am proud of that. These are the multitudes that I contain. And I think sometimes in our pursuit of ensuring, equity and justice of all voices and identities being represented, this is still an identity that deserves a seat at the table and should be a part of it, even if are the reason that for so long so many people did not have seats at the table. It just changes how we are represented at seat, right? We're not at the head of the table anymore. This is a circular table and we're all playing in a fair role and an equivalent role in that process. So that's the one for me is really allowing us to have that identity come up. And I would say the other where we've really ceded the territory and I would love to see us play more of a role is I don't want to say that we've been told to dial protection and providership down to 0%, but I think we've allowed the kind of subtitle for those categories to be defined by the opposition rather than through a more progressive lens. And by progressive, I mean future thinking and future oriented and inclusive. And I'm a big advocate for saying we need to continue to use these terminologies, in my opinion, because they're what has cultural capital. They're what people understand. And again, there's not anything inherently wrong with them. They are roles that people play in their families and their communities, protecting and providing. We need to expand what those definitions are. Rather than shying away and letting somebody else own the territory of those words, why don't we try to use those words and expand what's possible for them, right? So let's just use providership as an example. Why are we allowing this definition to become providership is the person who goes out and makes the money to buy the food when providership is also being the person who goes to the grocery store, being the person who prepares the meal, being the person who brings the food to the table. Providership is also providing a safe space for dialogue. It's providing mentorship. It's teaching how to do something. It's putting gas in the car when you notice that somebody's tank is low. It has all these different forms and representations that we have refused to try to like expand and create more to. And because of that, it's allowing that box to continue to shrink. So the second piece that I would really advocate for is let's kind of use this language that this other side has weaponized against them. Let's start diving into this and saying, yeah, hell yeah, these are our jobs. We are protectors and providers, and these are the things that we do to make that possible, right? Another example of this would be, what I think is also protectorship and providership? Voting. I'm voting for the society that I want to provide to my community and to my family. I am voting to protect their rights. I'm voting to protect their safety, their freedom of speech, whatever these things are. These are also expressions of that. And because we're not participating in this language conversation anymore. Again, we're ceding the ground. And yet, what do we know? The Equimundo's research from earlier this year in their State of American Men report, I think the number is 87% of men and 78% of women define a provider as the key role of a man. So this is not restricted to one side or the other. This is how we all pretty much define the role of this. And yet we're not trying hard enough to kind of get in there and say like, okay, you can own that identity a little bit, but let's just start to change, like the brightness and contrast on a photo. Let's start to play around with what that is.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great analogy at the end, by the way, and very thoughtful response. I appreciate it. Yeah, and it sounds like the right needs to redefine the core definitions and understandings of some of the things that they really identify with, and then that the left can work on not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying like while it's neutral in definition, there are a lot of men that commonly associate with certain stereotypes, and it doesn't mean those stereotypes are the definition. But for a lot of men, they almost need to be known within feeling relatable and common, right? Like, "Oh, this guy struggles with that too," or, "Oh, that's normal for a lot of guys to do X, Y, and Z." And then meet them there by essentially affirming, like, "Yeah, you know what? Like, that's a normal experience, and it doesn't have to be the new normal. Now let's expand, like, what does that look like to take it, you know."
A friend of mine, Dwayne Martin, he works at Men for Choice, which is a group working to expand pro choice resources and legislation across the country. He said once, if we're looking to expand rights, expand the pie, welcome more people into the tent, whatever it is, you got to let people shit in the house. Because if you don't do that, they're never going to come in the first place. And if you don't invite them in, you're never going to have dialogue. And I think that's something that we often forget is, or at least the way I perceive our situation now, unless we get people to agree with us, you're never able to make change, right? Because you got to get, 50 plus one, right? This is what we need to be able to make something happen in an ideal, perfectly functioning democracy. We can have a separate podcast where we discuss the state of ours. So that means you got to be in dialogue. You can't bludgeon people into agreeing with you. You can't shame people into agreeing with you, because that only works insofar as someone else does not come along and do a better job of it. And so I always think about that metaphor, because to me, it's really important. You got to meet people where they are. And that means they're going to make mistakes along the way, and you don't ostracize them because they've done that, but you work to help them understand more holistically, like the choices that they've made, the choices that they are making, and what those mean for them. Especially because, again, when we think about providership as being just defined basically through capitalistic means, we can start to understand why that definition has persisted for so long, because those who benefit from it the most push that down to a society so they can maintain power and control, because financial providership is a limited means. There's only so much of it to go around. There's only so much to extract, that if we continue to define it that way, there will always be an elite class of people who are able to do that. And the rest of us will ruin our lives seeking to perform that, when we will never have access to the same means of capital that this other group of people have.
Yeah, so well said. And that last piece is a factor I have been more and more considering in understanding the role of capitalism in affecting the definition and expression of masculinity, both in the Ecomundo report that you mentioned, and also, I've had a few people comment on my YouTube channel, essentially like, we need to start talking about more of the socioeconomic and the class analysis essentially in this conversation that deeply informs how we go about it. And the two quotes that come to mind, as far as inviting people into dialogue, is one is a question: would you rather be right or would you rather love? And I think we have to start on understanding people before we demand to be understood, and realize it's out of that love that, in a way, a deeper sense of rightness of relationship actually comes up, more than the cerebral sense of rightness and morality of like, this is what we need to do. And until we kind of bypass that more analytical power dynamic struggle level, we don't get there. And then the second is a quote from Richard Rohr. He says, the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. So if we really want to truly critique and essentially reveal the wrongness of a situation, the best way to do that is for us to practice a better way. What's a different way that's more functional, that's more effective, that's more holistic, that's more accessible, that's more understandable, right? And it, just by modeling those examples, it'll trump and kind of put those lesser ideal and toxic or dysfunctional expressions of masculinity to rest. And speaking of this kind of changing our definition of words and understanding, your journey with male friendship seems connected to your journey with your father that you mentioned earlier. Tell me about that connection, how the relationship with your dad shows up, and how you relate to men. And then I'm love to hear your Be a Pal framework, which is so fun and also helpful for guys to understand how to go about friendship.
When my father died, again, it was during COVID, and as we all remember, we were not able to do things like have funerals then, right? So we were all doing these kind of virtual memorials, virtual services, to try to find ways to connect and remember and participate in community in these really difficult and challenging times. And what we did at that point in time for our family, we did Zoom. no, excuse me, not a Zoom. Everybody was doing Zooms. We opted to do a Facebook Live where we kind of built a little shrine in the house, angled a camera at it, and allowed people to kind of pop on for a couple of hours, leave messages, and participate in kind of a group memorial that way. That was the focus that we put on it. So we had people come in, and when that finished, I'm sitting there kind of reading the whole audit of what people had to say. And what I started to realize was that my accountant was there. My mom's mahjong community was there. My mom's friend's husband from back home was there. My friends were there. My friends' parents were there. The guy my dad rode the train with for a few years was there. The guy my dad played golf with was there. And what I started to realize was where his like friends, right? Like people you know on your commute, they're not necessarily your friends. You're having surface level conversations. And what that came to for me was, with the exception of his one friend from back home in Boston, I started to realize like my dad, I don't think he had any friends. Like I actually think he was lonely. Like he didn't have anyone who was a safe home. He had no one to hype him up. He had no one to hold his pain. Like he was alone. And so I'm starting to notice how disconnected my father was from community in general. And that really didn't resonate with me at first because, well, I have very rich friendships and community, and I always have in my life. You know, one year I went to 14 weddings in a year, right? Like the size of community has never been a problem for me. But the more I sat with this, the more I saw what was happening to men in this country, the more I started to look internally and recognize, well, actually, let me break down these friendship circles that I have. I'm friends with a ton of women. I would say probably 65% of my friendships are women. And that 35% who are men I've carried with me from the majority of these, 80-20 rule. The 35% of men here are men I've known from childhood, from elementary school, middle school, and high school. As an adult, I have really struggled to make new male friendships, intimate ones, in the sense of people who really know my vulnerabilities, my fears, my weaknesses, whatever, and my struggles. And I could maybe count those men on one hand. And I was really troubled by that because the older we get, right, the harder it is to maintain those older friendships. And also the more like isolated we become because we have our own lives, right? Proximity is really important to the maintenance of friendships. And I had moved out to the West Coast. Not a lot of those men are here. And so what I started to realize is, okay, my father was isolated. I'm noticing the trouble I've had making new male friendships as an adult. His isolation is probably part of the reason he died because he was unable to connect with people. I'm starting to not necessarily repeat that same pattern, but I'm seeing his struggle reflected in my own life in terms of how I related to men. And you add to that the original male relationship in my life, a terrible relationship with my dad. And now I'm going, okay, well, now I understand why I have trouble because I had a terrible relationship with him. The model for all of it is rotten at the core. And so that started me on this journey of saying, like, I need to get back in community with men and I need to heal my relationship with men. And so on the one hand, it started with breaking up with my therapist because to this point in my life, I'd only ever seen female therapists. And now I'm starting to understand why. It's because they were safety to me. And I needed to go outside that comfort zone to continue to heal. So started seeing a male therapist and then also said, like, I need to create spaces to make male friendships. And so for me, that led to the development of a group called Walking Talking Men here in Los Angeles, starting the West Coast chapter of that. It started in New York with Mark Green and Mark Weidman. And it also meant having a lot more conversations with men because I was recognizing I was not the only person suffering from this. And so I've started to do a lot more work writing content creation around this particular subject and kind of develop the framework for what I'm seeing through these conversations for how men can start to heal from what they've understood about what male connection looks like and starting to build, new relationships. So to your point, I call it the Be a Pal framework because everything's got to have a cute name. I'm a marketer at heart. And it basically has about 4 or 5 components to it. And the first is befriending yourself. I think that's the part we often forget about in the interpersonal relationships is you've got to start from a good place for you before you're able to go out and do it. Understanding what you want, what you need, what you're looking for. So the B part is befriending yourself has a couple of components to it. It's all about kind of starting to step outside the man box for yourself of turning in that badge, right? You can't be a good friend to others if you're going to police their behavior. So that starts with not policing your own. Something that I think is really important, which is writing your own eulogy. Starts to think about how you want to show up in the world and how you want to be remembered. And then also just going to friend yourself, right? Doing self-investigation, journaling, going on adventures. That's how you want to be a friend for others. Demonstrate that for you first. Then The A, again, everything's got a purpose. A is about auditing your friendships, understanding what your network looks like. For me, right, I was like, I have all these amazing friendships. I don't need to change. Oh, wait, a lot of them are legacy. How am I continuing to nurture and enrich that? And also, how am I pruning that from the people who can't continue to grow with me on where I'm going? And then the PAL component is where we really start to look outwardly. So the first part of that is P, which is propose, right? I think a lot of us men are afraid to step outside the box and actually make that ask for fear of being shot down. So it's how to go about proposing friendship dates with men, activities with men to go do, and also dealing with rejection. The A component is about acting like a kid. So it's having play dates and asking great questions, right? Approaching with curiosity, things that we do really well and form the basis of friendships when we're children. And science has borne this out, but we struggle to do when we're adults. And then the last component of it, which I think is probably the most difficult for a lot of men, is all about loving on them and really expressing your emotions and telling them how you feel, which, in a lot of the writing I work on through kind of demonstration here. So that is the framework that I'm working on advocating for right now to share this. And, I would say it's definitely what I've done in my own life to reach this point. So anecdotally, it's working.
Yeah, I'm just struck by your insight about how that model for male friendships started with your father, that first caregiver imprint. And I think that's a deadly simple, but yet overlooked component to how a lot of men internalize friendships. We have overemphasized that just male loneliness, male loneliness, male loneliness, but kind of asking, well, where does that start? And I think to your point, it really is so deeply embedded in how we see our fathers interact with other men, and in general, how we see older men act with other men, right? It's this kind of like awkward, like we always need to be kind of physically rigid. There's a space between us. And then when we talk, it's always about sports or the weather or anything that's going to be neutral and actually create or keep a barrier, let's say, from connecting. And your framework addresses all of those. But I think for any guy listening that's wondering, gosh, I am struggling with making friends. I think first it just speaks to like it's difficult for all of us to learn how to do that healthily because we've been given such broken models. And so give yourself some compassion that like unless you grew up with a dad that had a robust group of friends, and hopefully our generation's changing that, right? And for our kids in that generation, they'll see that like you probably think the same and go about it the same way. But now using this framework, it can be helpful. And I'm curious, like when you lay out the framework, have you found, you kind of mentioned this at the very end, that last letter, love on guys, is very difficult. Any other letters that you find that many men really struggle with starting to do or wrapping their head around seeing the need for? And then any letters you've been surprised by, wow, a lot of men really jump on this one and really do this a lot more naturally than I thought.
Yeah, for sure. I think the auditing one is one that people kind of jump on because it feels businessy and professional. And as my friend Mark Green likes to say, who started, the co-founder for Walking Talking Men, as he likes to say, men tend to approach friendships as networking, right? When you're on the softball team, you go there and it's like, we are talking about softball. We are talking about the scores of softball. We are working on the lineup for the game. And so we're kind of giving that, like the audit language helps you think about it from like a business perspective. So if they're like a professional like person, they kind of gravitate towards that. And it's also, it's a little bit easier because you're not having to investigate on the surface of it, how you feel about someone or what something is just saying like, you're basically saying, write a list, right? That's the first component of that. So I do find kind of people gravitate to that a little bit. I think you nailed like the love component is really hard. I think some of the hardest components of the other two pieces would be some of the work in kind of befriending yourself because it requires that self-investigation that we're not often doing. It can be a really tough for men to approach things like, what are your boundaries? What do you want to be remembered for? Are really big questions we often don't think about enough. And that's bigger than just masculine issues. I think that's cultural issues as well and how we think about and perceive death. But again, topic for episode 2 of this interview. And the other piece, I do think dealing with rejection and actually making the ask for men can be really difficult and something they're afraid of. And a huge part of that is because of the homophobia that's latent in, American masculinity. Overcoming that hurdle, I think, would also be a second big difficulty point for a lot of.
You mentioned that connections fragment over time based on your developmental stage. Like you change neighbors, you have ex partners after divorce, you change jobs and coworkers. And along the way, you found that there are all these types of men coming to the walking, talking men who find themselves in this ever evolving kind of social dynamics of just this change. There's not a lot of stability just by the nature of life and its complexity. But within that, you've named that there's this cultural expectation that you shouldn't present a problem without a solution, that that's a sign of weakness or that you don't have value. How does that expectation itself become the problem? And then what does real vulnerability look like when you're not trying to solve anything based on being on that new dynamic, whether, you're a newly divorced person or new to the neighborhood, new job, etc.
Yeah, I think I want to give a shout out to A Call to Men, an organization that I have the opportunity to serve on the board of. And I cannot remember who said it to me, but one of the employees of that organization said something to me that I carry with me to this day that was really important and a life changing lesson. I don't need to have all the answers to be in search of hope and healing. And that was a formative lesson for me at a stage in my life where I was working on figuring out kind of who I am again in the world and who I want to integrate as. And what I took from that is that it's okay to speak up. Because if you're in a room of 10 people and the leader in that room makes a decision and everybody feels uncomfortable with it, but nobody voices it because they don't feel like they have a better answer, but they know something's wrong, you make the wrong decision. But one person speaking up and saying, like, hey, I don't like that, even if you don't have an answer, that person isn't a nuisance or an annoyance. That person's an invitation to affirm the decision you already made or to say, hey, I also don't like this. I don't have an answer either, but let's all work together and maybe figure out something better. Or maybe there is that person in the room who did know, but was afraid to speak up because they felt insecure. And now you've given them permission to share that better idea. And so I think because we have always kind of been told, like, don't speak up unless you have an answer, or don't offer this kind of feedback or whatever. I think it's part of how we've created a culture that has not invited change in a lot of different ways, because we are told if you don't have the answer, you are less than, you're not as valuable, you're not contributing, so stop trying to shake the status quo. But it's also meant that we're burying ourselves and we're burying our truth under all of these things because we're afraid not to speak. It's to say, I don't feel well, I don't know how to do something about it, but this is what I'm experiencing. It's okay to not be okay, right? And all we have to do is kind of name that and speak that out there. And maybe that's an invitation for someone else to go, I'm hurting too, or I've hurt in the same way before. And here's what I did to heal from it. I've hurt in the same way before, and I can hold you as you go through that. I don't have a solution, but I'm here to support you. And so I think naming those things, it's an invitation for someone to come help you. And don't we all just want to be helpful and useful to other people? Like, why are we cutting other people off from that chance and from that opportunity?
What a powerful question, and reminds me of an interview I heard with the poet David White, who says, one of the most powerful and disarming forms of communication you can say as an individual is "I don't know," and he says if you can lead with that, there's this radical confidence that who you are and the value of that person that you are is not contingent on the ability to produce or provide an answer, that you can freely say that you don't know. And to your point, it's an invitation to help other people come in and help you. I would add on to that, said it's also an invitation for collaboration, because if you're always the person with an answer, you're always the one that's coming in with a plan, you're always the person that doesn't need any insight or guidance or understanding from anyone else, you're essentially using the social dynamic or the circle not as collaboration, but as competition. And when you can come in and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking, but where are you all at with this? What do you think? Am I missing something? What's your sense of it? Then that invites everyone else around you to collaborate and contribute to the collective thought, instead of this self-reliance and this idolatry that the self is the most important person, when you are an important person, but you're not the most important person. And it really allows you, to have that connection. But those 2 points, I think, really speak to that analogy that your friend said from that organization, and how we can approach male friendship and dynamics.
Absolutely.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for making the time to chat today. Just so much wisdom and insight and humor along the way, which I really appreciate in good New York fashion. And I'm curious where people can find your work.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wes. This has been such a great conversation. You asked fabulous, fabulous questions. And it's given me a lot to think about that. I'll even carry from here. For folks who want to continue to follow my work, jonathanjacobs.com is my website. I'm most active on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram. Instagram, Jonathan Jacobs 89. TikTok for as long as it continues to exist. Real John Jacobs, John, Jon. But everything's available at my website to link to. And I would love to be in conversation with anyone listening who wants to continue these dialogues.
Yes, absolutely. And this conversation meant so much in furthering the greater conversation around masculinity. We'll make sure to put that all in the show notes. And guys, until next time.
Take care. Thank you, Wes.